So let's now also use the custom hook for the entered email. For this, I'll call useInput here, and we get back this object with all that data we can pull out and use here. For example, the value which I'll assign to a entered email alias. The isValid value which I'll assign to a entered email isValid alias. We'll get hasError, which I'll assign to the email input hasError alias, and reformat this to make it easier to read. We'll get the value change handler, which I'll assign to email change handler, and the same for the input blur handler, which I assign to email blur handler, and then reset, which I'll assign to reset email input. We also need to pass in our validation function, and hence I'll grab this logic, and then again, define a function here, inline, which gets a value, which will be passed in from inside the hook, where I then return the result of calling includes at on this value. This determines whether this is valid or not. With that, I can get rid of these two lines of code. We can get rid of these two lines of code here. And then here, for the overall form validity, we already are using entered email is valid, so that works. We can get rid of the email input change handler and the email input blur handlers. Here in the form submission handler, we also, of course, want to reset the email input. And then here, I want to use the email input hasError field to determine the CSS classes. And if we scroll down to the JSX code, here I want to use the email change handler and the email blur handler and the email input hasError field here. And with that, we're using this hook for the email input as well. We can also get rid of the use state import now, because here I'm now not using use state anymore. And with that again, if I reload here, this both behaves as it did before, but now with less code duplication here. Now we have a working code here with help of our custom hook, which we can call and pull out the values which we need, where all the logic then resides inside of that hook, and hence our component can stay a bit leaner and can focus mostly on the JSX, on validating the overall form, which is fairly simple, and on handling the form submission. Now, again, let's practice what we learned. We have this basic form component here. Let's go to app.js and swap this simple input here for the basic form component. And of course, therefore also add the import here to basic form from /components basic form, so that if we save that, we got this form. Now, this is still a form, still not too fancy, but it of course now has 3 inputs instead of 2, and it's a brand new form without any validation at all. And I now want you to again apply what we learned, if possible, of course, without looking at simple input, at least not in great detail. And use our custom hook here, or if you're feeling super fancy, try building up that custom hook from scratch again, to again practice what we did over the last lectures. So start with the validation here by using state in the basic form, start with validation for the individual inputs, then build your custom hook, and then start using that hook for the inputs. If you're getting stuck with that, simply go back to the previous lectures to see how we built up the validation logic and the custom hook step by step there, and then try it on your own again. Once you're done with that, continue with the next lecture, because there I will wire up this brand new form to our custom hook and then take it from there. Were you successful? I really recommend that you have a look at those last lectures again to fully understand how you manage entered values, validity, and touch state, and combine that all with different event handlers to make sure that you deliver the user experience you wanna deliver. Now here, in this case, I will continue with that finished custom hook, which we built already. I will not build up that entire logic again from scratch, because I feel like I would basically just be wasting your time if I did that, because it's just what we did in the previous lectures. But I do want to apply the custom hook here one more time to really show you how you could do that in a brand new empty form. And therefore, we start by importing user input from, going up one level, hooks user input. We then, of course, call user input here. And we call it 3 times because we have 3 inputs here. Now, the validation logic for these 3 inputs is up to you. I didn't give you any restrictions or guidance there. But it makes sense to ensure that these inputs aren't empty and that the email address is an email address. So for that, for the first 2 inputs, I'll check if the value we're getting is not empty if we trim it. And since I'll use the same function here, rather than copy and pasting it like this, I will create a new function outside of the component function, because that's not a function that needs to be rebuilt if the component is rebuilt. And I will name it isNotEmpty, store my function in this constant, and then just pass this constant here, which holds this function in the end. So this is really just the function outsourced into a separate constant. And I can do something similar for the email, isEmail. And here I get a value and check that this includes an @ symbol. And then I pass isEmail to the third user input call. Now the custom hook returns an object, as we learned, and that object is full of data which we can use. For example, it contains the value, and we might want to use the value here to be able to reset it once the form is submitted. So here, this is for my first input. I'll have the first name value. Then we get isValid, so this is first name is valid. And I'm assigning these aliases here because I'm going to extract the same keys 2 more times. So we need aliases to avoid name clashes. And here we also get the value change handler, which I'll alias with first name change handler. I get the input blur handler, which I pull out, which I alias with first name blur handler. And the reset function, which I'll alias with reset first name, like this. And then I'll copy this here, this code, and repeat this here for the second use input call. But of course here it's the last name value and the last name is valid. And here it's therefore also last name change handler and last name blur handler and reset last name. And then copy and paste it one more time for the last input, and that's the email value, and the email is valid, and here it's the email change handler and the email blur handler, and here is reset email. And now with that all done, we can go down to the JSX code, and on the first input, for example, bind our first name value. For onChange, we bind first name change handler, and for onBlur, we bind the first name blur handler, like this. Then for the second input, we bind value to last name value, onChange to last name change handler, and onBlur, unsurprisingly, to last name blur handler. And then here for this input, I bind my value to email value, onChange to the email change handler, and onBlur to the email blur handler. Now, I also want to show error messages if appropriate, and I want to show different class names or add different class names, and I also want to disable the submit button if the form is invalid. So let's start with the class names and the error texts. For this, there's one other field we can extract, and that's the hasError field, which I'll store in a first name hasError alias. And here on the second use input call, it's last name hasError. And here on the third custom hook usage, it's email hasError. And it's this hasError field which we can now use, because now we can infer those class names, for example. Here I have my first name classes, and for that I'll take my first name hasError key, and if I have an error, I'll add a class of form-control invalid, otherwise just form control. And I will repeat this error for last name classes and email classes. And here we then have the last name hasError and email hasError. And then here we bind our first name classes, and on the second div we bind the last name classes, and on that last div we bind the email classes. Now for the error messages, we simply go to the first input where we might need an error message like please enter a first name. And here we check if first name hasError, and if that's the case, we show this paragraph, otherwise not. And I then copy that logic to the second input where I say please enter a last name, and I check for last name hasError. And we copy it one more time to the email address where I check for email hasError, and I say please enter a valid email address. So now that's all wired up. Now for the overall form validity, we can again derive that state. We can add a form is valid state, which initially is false. And then we check if the first name is valid and the last name is valid and the email is valid, and all three have to be valid. And only if they are all three valid, I'll set form is valid to true. If at least one of them is not valid, the form will stay invalid. So now we have the form is valid state. We can use that to disable the button, for example, to set disabled to not form is valid. If the form is not valid, the button is disabled. Last but not least, for the form submission, which I also want to add here, I'll add the onSubmit handler and then simply add a new function here. Submit handler could be the name, where I get an event. And as you learned, we call event prevent default here to prevent that browser default of sending a request. And then I check if the form is not valid. And if it's not valid, I return. And that's, by the way, new. In simple input, I didn't do that in the form submission handler. There, I was still checking for the entered name only. And that was an oversight from my side, but of course, we can't even reach that handler since the button is disabled anyways. Nonetheless, adding that extra check here might make sense, because the user could theoretically enable the button with the DevTools, which of course is not really what the user should do, but it could be done. So having the extra validation step in here still also could make sense. And then thereafter, if the form is valid and we made it past this check, I will console log submitted, and then also console log my values. So the first name value, the last name value, and the email value. And then I will call reset first name, reset last name, and reset email. Now we can wire up the submit handler here, and we should be good to go. If we save everything and go back here, the button is grayed out by default. If I click in there, I get this error, and this error, and this error, and the errors are not red because I forgot to assign the right CSS class here. On these paragraphs, we should add a CSS class of error dash text. So make sure you add this on the first name error paragraph and the last name paragraph and the email error paragraph. Now they are red. And of course, if I enter valid values here, then this becomes submittable. And if we open the DevTools and I click submit, I see submitted, I see the entered values, and it's reset. And again, it's working as before now. So this is looking good now. And now we applied our custom hook and what we learned to this new form as well. Now let's talk about simplifications and what else we could do. Now you could definitely try to outsource more logic. You could try to build individual input components which contain some validation logic or whatever. You could build an overall form component which handles a lot of that. You could build more custom hooks which, for example, return entirely pre-configured inputs or forms. And attached you find an article on that which might also be interesting to you, where we also build a complete use form hook which even spits out readily configured input elements which you can use in JSX. I want to focus on the basics here though, and that is already a long module. For me, it mattered to explain how we can use what we learned about React to build great user experiences and to build forms and form behaviors that make sense to our users, that feel good to our users. And at the same time, I of course also wanted to show you that this can lead to a lot of unnecessary code, and therefore building something like this custom use input hook can reduce code duplication and allows us to reuse logic. Even though we now of course still have some replicated code, but it is distinct enough, I would argue. Nonetheless, you can dive into building more elaborate custom hooks, and this attached article might be interesting for that. In addition, there also are third-party libraries that could be interesting to you. For example, Formic. Formic is a very popular third-party library for working with forms, and you can dive into the official docs to learn more about it. It's not really using hooks that much. It's more using components and patterns we know from older versions of React, so to say. But nonetheless, it's a great library when it comes to rendering forms and dealing with more complex forms and validation. Again, you can explore the official docs to learn how it works. The core idea is that you don't have to write much state management logic, but that instead you write your validation logic, you define your fields, and then let Formic do the rest. A little bit as we did it with our custom use input hook. There we also focus on passing in the validation logic, and the hook then manages the state for us. Formic then just has more use cases and outsources even more logic, or allows us to outsource even more logic to it. So that might definitely be worth a look. Now for this course though, I'm happy with this approach. You again got more practice with working with custom hooks, and you really see what's going on behind the scenes. Now you are definitely well prepared to handle forms and user input in your next projects. And of course, we are also going to work a bit more with forms in the course projects you'll find in the rest of this course.